Thank you, Laura. And I'll say that, when we first started conceptualizing this series, and Brian and Nick and Jesse are in the room, it was always part of my plan to include a session on disability and technology because that's really, um, it was in my research on Paralympic sport and with Paralympic athletes that I really started to use technology and also, as you'll see, started to find both how technology can facilitate some types of research, making it more accessible or enabling me at least to access different communities, engage with different communities, but then also some of the challenges that I wasn't prepared for and hadn't really thought through when I first started doing my field work. So that's a bit of what I'm going to be sharing with you today. But before I get started, I'm just going to start by playing a video. This video, it's about 5 minutes long, but I think I'll cut it a bit short. And it's from one of the research projects that I worked on as a postdoctoral researcher. But I'm not going to tell you anything else about it. I'd like to just play it first.
My name is Mateen, and I'm an England blind footballer. At the age of 8, my dream of football was taken away from me as I had detached retinas in both eyes. Until 2009, there was no opportunity for me to play football. This all changed when me and a few friends applied for funding to set up a blind football academy in Leicester. My dream of playing football had come back and I felt good about myself. In 2009, I trained on a weekly basis with Leicester, but as we didn't have our own team in the National League, I was asked to play for London. I played for London for a season while also training in Leicester. In 2010, Leicester were granted permission to have their own team in the league. This was a big moment for the city, as there had never been a team from Leicester in the league. In 2010, while playing for Leicester, I was also given the great news that I had been selected to train with the England development squad. Now I felt my dream of being an international footballer had been reignited. For the next 2 years, I carried on playing for Leicester in the league, whilst also training with England on a regular basis. Being a part of the development squad was a big change for me. The whole setup, having people looking out for you in a physical and technical way. I was given big targets to train on my skill and fitness. In 2012, I could feel my work was getting rewarded as I was then selected to be a part of the England senior squad. My dream was gathering momentum. I was part of the England team now. I was a national player for my country. 2013 was a big year for me. While training with England, being looked after by England, developing my skill, my fitness, my all-round game, being able to train at facilities where actual England players train. It was all a dream. In May, I was given the chance to represent my country for the first time. This day, words cannot explain. The honor of playing for your country, representing the country, being so proud when walking onto that pitch with my England kit on, lining up for the national anthem, hearing my name on the PA system, it was all amazing. After that game, my hunger for football had just gone to a new level. I didn't want to lose my spot in the squad. I was loving every minute of it. Being a professional footballer for England, having all the facilities like a proper footballer should have. In 2013,
I'm going to pause that video there, and I'm actually going to return to it a bit later in the presentation, but I just want you to keep Mateen's story in mind when I talk about some of the research that I've been doing with different disability sport communities. I think many of you in the room have probably heard the story before, but my interest in disability sport really started in about 2008 when I was just wrapping up my master's project. Wrapping up my master's project and sorry, we're getting feedback in the room.
It could also be if anyone joined us remotely, has their microphone and their speaker on, that could be the problem.
Let's oh, and maybe that solved it. Okay, don't know why, but I first became interested in disability sport when I was wrapping up my master's and starting my PhD, and I had been a competitive cross-country skier but was about to retire when a local athlete convinced me to stay on a bit longer because she needed a guide to train for the 2010 Paralympic Games. And that's when I started skiing with Courtney, but it was also when I was designing my PhD research, and it was Courtney who convinced me that what she really wanted was a blog that was going to be a place for athletes to discuss issues that were important to them as Paralympic athletes, as members of the Paralympic movement. So she was really looking to try to create this online community for conversations and debates that weren't happening in her offline community because she was the only athlete with an impairment in our particular club. So with Courtney and a few others, we went on to create Athletes First. It was a blog about disability in sport. Those were the only real two requirements, is every post had to have some aspect that was unique to being an athlete with a disability or involved in disability sport, and had to have a sport aspect. And it was written by a group of, myself and then 5 Paralympic athletes, and with occasional guest writers. And we use it as a place to have discussions, and more importantly, I think, debates. These were real conversations. So someone would write a post, but their goal would always be to get others talking about the issue. So our post would sort of have a question or leave something hanging, and then we would try to create this conversation online. When I started the project, I have to say I wasn't really thinking about the intersections of disability and technology. I was thinking about the intersections of disability and sport. But very quickly, it became apparent to me that, if I was actually going to be writing about this for my PhD research, I needed to get back at what was some of the literature on the accessibility of technology, and particularly the use of technology in creating communities or forming community connections between people with disabilities. So this is where I started to come across some really interesting things. The first being some of the writing by Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. In his very first sort of public address, he said that the power of the web is in its universality, that access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. This theme was picked up by many others and was part of this broader discourse that the web was going to be accessible and it was going to promote or enhance social inclusion by groups that had been marginalized or that had barriers to other forms of social participation. There were really 2 different ways that this was theorized. The first was that the physical environment is full of barriers. Built environment, so inaccessible buildings. And that it is this built environment that creates barriers to access for people with disabilities. Well, the online environment apparently wasn't going to have these same barriers. So it was going to be a barrier-free space, and this would sort of by default increase access to education, employment, and social opportunities for people with disabilities. So you saw all these different sort of utopic visions of people being able to study or work online in their accessible homes through online technologies. The second way it was really discussed was that disability simply wasn't going to matter in a disembodied space. That you could somehow leave behind not just disability, but other social identities that are embodied. So gender, race, disability, you could choose essentially how you were going to present yourself online, and that this would offer people the opportunity to discard stigmatized or devalued identities. In short, it's sort of this idea that online you could be anyone, and the assumption being you would not choose to be disabled. So if I think about the Athletes First project and whether or not either of these two utopic visions of the web really manifested in what we were doing, I look first at that increased access to social worlds. What was happening at Athletes First, providing new opportunities for athletes with disability to connect in a way that was not possible in their physical environments? And to this, I have to say overwhelmingly, yes. I mean, this became a really strong theme in the research. And when I interviewed people who were participating on the blog, either as writers, as readers, who were sharing the blog, who were tweeting about it, they repeated that, the web was increasing their ability to access parasport by providing them access to information, by providing the ability to find different programs, by providing simple things like being able to ask people what kind of equipment they were using or what kind of modifications they were using to their equipment. So there were lots of networks being formed on the Athletes First platform itself, but also among our readers, among our writers, who were using this in really practical ways to increase their access to parasport. So on one hand, they were engaging differently online than they were able to, or with different people online than they were able to in their offline environments, but they were actually using it to increase offline access to sport as well. So breaking down some of the physical barriers by being able to connect with communities online. However, when I look at that sort of second claim, that disability simply wasn't going to matter online in the same way it does in our face-to-face interactions, I didn't find that was really evidenced. In fact, I saw many, many examples of people reproducing their embodied identities in online contexts. The most common example of this was that people would start their posts, either the blogs they were writing or their responses to the blog posts, by stating that they had a disability, or by giving their history of impairment, or explaining, the accident or the illness that brought them to parasport in the first place. And in fact, this was how they were gaining access to the conversations. This was seen as being an essential part of having some authority to speak to the issue. So when I reviewed the post later and said, in how many, despite the fact that everyone could have posted, we have no way of knowing who was posted. We have no way of knowing if this is a person who has a disability or not. Most of the posts were made by people who stated they had a disability. And very few posts were made by people who stated they did not have a disability. And when non-disabled people did post, it tended to be ask a question rather than to share information or to sort of make some more authoritative statement. So I definitely did not see this notion that people would attempt to distance themselves from disability identities in online contexts. This is where I'm going to go a bit to a second project I did that was using using technology in the context of disability sport. And this is the project in which that story by Mateen Noré was created. It was part of my postdoctoral research conducted in the UK following the 2012 Paralympic Games. And the question I was interested in exploring there was, how did people with disabilities and disability communities in the UK really understand the Paralympic Games. And you might remember, but the motto of London 2012 was inspire a generation. So I was particularly interested in speaking with youth who were supposedly part of this generation that would be inspired by the Paralympic Games. When looking for how I might engage youth, and in particular youth with disabilities, I came across the method of digital storytelling. Digital storytelling is a fairly commonly used or fairly widespread use in community-based research methods. And it's based on a couple premises. The first, that everyone has a story to tell. The second being, everyone has an ability to tell their story. And it's often presented as a way of including individuals in research, in generating research data, who might not be able to participate in more traditional forms of data collection. It's described quite frequently, and I would say often unreflexively, as being a low barrier and accessible research option. This is how I started. I walked in to my first digital storytelling workshop. I had spent several months researching the method, practicing to be a workshop facilitator, going over all the different elements of stories. I had a bag of iPads and audio recorders and all sorts of other technological tools. And about 5 minutes into my workshop, I thought, oh, this isn't going to work. It had never occurred to me how ocular-centric, and I'll thank Laura for providing me with that word. At the time, I didn't have a word for it, but how ocular-centric these methods were. And I was looking into a room of athletes, about half who had visual impairments, who are completely blind. And what I was about to ask them to do was to create a digital story, and every example I had included drawings, photographs, video. So this is, I guess, where Mateen's story comes in. That video I first showed you. Mateen was one of the players in that football center participating in this workshop, and he is completely blind. Mateen was the one who said, well, no, actually, this isn't going to be a problem for me. I'm just going to work with someone else. And Mateen and his coach, Sam, created the story that you saw. So it was a bit of an adaptation to, I guess, more traditional digital storytelling circles, where the story is created in a workshop, but everyone creates a very individual story. What ended up happening in our workshop was that stories were always created by a collective, with someone creating the narrative and other people adding a different element, whether that was the visuals, whether that was the sound, or some other aspects of the story. And here I'm just going to play you what I consider to be the partner story to Noreen's, or to Mateen's rather. Oops. This is where I need to turn my sound back.
Football. Just like you. For a long time I didn't know that blind football existed. I didn't even consider that people who are blind would play football. Why would they? Starting out as a coach, I followed the usual route of courses, but for some reason, the Coaching Disabled Footballers course through the FA caught my interest. It was then that I gained a small insight to a game for blind footballers. A keen interest in disability football developed into a strong passion, eventually leading me to become a disability football development officer with a professional club and county FA. During my time in this role, I was lucky enough to coach people of all ages who were born blind, or lost their sight over time. Supporting a local sight support charity, players of all abilities had the chance to learn to play football, and they gave me the chance to learn about life without sight. Devoting my time to disability football, probably more than my family would like, opened doors to a range of opportunities. A highlight for me was volunteering at the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. A first-hand experience of the world's greatest blind footballers was the learning experience any young coach would love. And I did. Every single minute of it. Even staying in
I'll stop there, although all the videos from the project are available online. That's the story created by Sam, Mateen's coach. And that was a decision the two of them made, that Mateen's story was going to include visuals, and that his coach Sam would help him select the visuals from photos and videos and stuff that had been taken by the program. But Sam also sort of put the challenge to Mateen. Well, you use technology all the time. You're very good at technology. You're better at technology than I am in many ways. So Mateen taught Sam about some of the technologies he uses in his day-to-day life, and they created a video that I would say has no visuals. If you go right to the end, there are some flashes of the London 2012 games, but it is mostly without visuals, and it uses a voice recording technology. So I guess I finished with probably more questions than answers when I left that project, but it certainly raised in me an awareness that the practices of digital storytelling, although frequently described as very accessible, low barrier, are based on some very ableist assumptions. Technologies that were widely described as accessible were not, whereas people were often using technologies that I was unfamiliar with or hadn't considered. And I really came to start to rely on participants to, tell me what technologies you use, and we'll figure out how that works for a story. It also made me very, very aware that there are different types of digital divides, that although the literature often talks about a sort of singular digital divide of people who have access or who don't, I realized that the divides are based on income, who can afford the technologies. They're based on different forms of literacy, who knows how to use digital technologies. They're generational, and they are also most certainly based on, like I said, ableist assumptions about what technologies are accessible. And when I learned very quickly that is very, very individual. The other conclusions I suppose I arrived at were that in many ways we've reproduced our social worlds online. This space that is described as disembodied, is actually full of different stories about disability, different types of disability communities, and that if we're not really critical in our research practices, we risk recreating the exclusionary research practices, from our offline practices to our online practices. And that while those digital divides do exist, I think I left it feeling or understanding that different opportunities exist as well. On Athletes First, I certainly connected with people I would never have had access to in physical environments because there are a lot of barriers. And equally, some of the stories that were created as part of that final project, I could never have anticipated. And they were very rich and very illuminating in different ways. I'll end my talk there, but I certainly look forward to hearing about your own research experiences and maybe how you would have approached some of the challenges I encountered in this work.